Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. Today, we have a fantastic conversation with Alex Absalom. He and his wife, Hannah, lead Dandelion Resourcing, in which they train and coach others to be disciple makers, to start and engage in missional communities, and to be naturally supernatural, to be able to have healing and deliverance and hearing God's voice. This is a really good conversation, an important conversation for those of us in the West to figure out how we can have an overflow of the Spirit, be empowered by the Spirit in everyday life, have natural conversations that lead to praying for others, to see Jesus encounter people in everyday life. It's a fantastic conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. So here is Alex. Alex, well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. It's going to be a fun conversation.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me on,
Yeah,
Joshua.
it'll be great. One of the things that I really want to know is, when did your story intersect with a place of actually practically living out your faith? You know, a lot of times when we live in the West in a Christian environment, we like to understand theology, understand the Bible, what it means, and we think about life with Jesus a lot, but we don't often engage in a practice of life with Jesus. And so when did that engagement of life in community, making disciples, really start in your life?
Well, I wasn't raised in a Christian household, so I'd say I was raised in a good pagan household.
Yeah.
So I came to faith in my mid-teens and got discipled primarily at school. And I think it was a process. So I can remember being told, you read the Bible. So I started to read the Bible faithfully every day and reading the Gospels and had my little Bible reading notes and reading about all the miraculous stuff. And I can remember going to older Christians and saying, I've been reading about all these miraculous things, and it says we're meant to do them. So how do I find out how to do these things? I'd like to do it. And you'd find people would kind of shuffle and look at their feet, grunt, and give really unsatisfactory answers. So it was this kind of, I think it was a bug the Lord put in my spirit. And then from terms of the natural supernatural, it was when I was at college. So I had mono when I was there, and it kind of hung around for a little bit. And one day I was in the church service. So this is in England, obviously, but I had an American pastor. And I had this thought like, I ought to get Pastor Roger to pray for me. So I talked to him at the end of the service, and he goes, well, yeah, why don't we meet up this week? So I go around, and I was so excited because I thought I was going to discover like the ancient mystical prayer of how to pray for healing that had been passed by word of mouth from, through the generations, all the way back to the apostles, the original 12 apostles. And so we sit in this room and we chat a bit, and he goes, right, let's pray. And he like lays his hands on me and prays this clearly extempore prayer. And it finishes, and I'm like, all right, is that it? I mean, is there something more here? And the strange thing was that over the next 2 weeks, all my symptoms went away. I managed to turn and I'm healed. And then probably the kind of thing that kicked it on from there was I spent a long summer in South Africa. So this would have been 1990. So apartheid still in force.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela had just been released from prison. It was working with a Christian agency called African Enterprise, who started doing evangelism in the cities of Africa, but they were doing great Bible teaching, this beautiful base in near Pietermaritzburg, but also was serving the poor. Secretly behind the scenes, they were facilitating the peace process between there'll be a peace transition of power, and also they're into signs and wonders. Wow. And so the first time that was really impacted, went with a guy who was an Indian ethnicity, went to an Indian area in Durban because it was obviously very racially segregated then. And he called me his little pink friend, was how he introduced me. But we went to this place, and there was a little Indian church, but lots of Hindu friends were coming in, and they had these gatherings for this weekend, crazy busy. But I saw, first time I saw deliverance was there. So people who had made vows to gods, they have those little orange strings around their wrist or whatever. And when they tried to cut those off, demons would manifest. And we're watching healings happen. right in front of our eyes. That's some very dramatic healings take place. And it was in the midst of that and all the kind of this broader context of what was going on there, I felt the Lord say to me, you're to go and do this in the West. And it's this sense of how do we holistically live out the gospel? So it's like you're saying in the setup, it's the intro of we want to be about disciple making. So we do take, spiritual discipline seriously. We want to read the Bible. We want to be people of prayer. We've got to be on mission. We've got to reach the lost. And also we've got to do it in the power of the Spirit. And it's where those three intersect, I think, is how you start to build kingdom culture.
That's beautiful. And how do we have that intersection between that supernatural, the signs and wonders, and the discipleship and mission? And as we're living that out, it's really important that that intersection happens. So as we're living into kingdom and that kingdom culture happens, what do you think is the results of us living in kingdom culture to the culture around us? What is that result?
Well, we're told to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it is something of heaven on earth now. So the things we long for in the future. And I think there's a longing in everyone's heart. Obviously, as believers, we've got clearer language for it. But I think most lost people have this sense of this is how things should be, or when it's broken, it shouldn't be like this. I'm sure you've taken funerals for people, say a young person who dies of cancer or an accident, and everyone there, whatever they believe, is thinking this is not right. And there's something within us that's hardwired for that. And so I think where we can start to minister out of that, I think that's powerful. So it could be something very tangible, like a healing or a deliverance or prophetic word. It could be to do with social justice. So as we live out the gospel lifestyle in our cultures, it could be, where do systems and structures need to be changed. So I think it's different people have different callings within that, don't they? Some people have incredible ministry serving the poor. Some it might be they know how to reach the millionaires. Some it's just in my everyday neighborhood, or I serve at the school and I make a difference. But we're going, I think it's almost like, so there's these broader expressions we have, which, the 7 mountains of culture and society, all those sorts of things we talk about. But I think each individual believer has to know in this season, who is the Lord placed in my hands right now, or as a household, where are we meant to be primarily on mission right now?
So, that's important. I think it's so important that we all play a part in it, and we do. How do we come together to see holistic change happen when we're all off doing our own little thing? Is there any sort of communication with one another so that we can see communities really transform from within?
So the danger of us as Westerners is we tend to be very individualistic in how we process this. So it's work, and obviously, as there's much we can learn from non-Western cultures and believers how they do this. So I think one of the things is how we do this in community. So how do we form communities on a common mission? So one of the things that we've seen work well is, there's different language for missional communities or whatever, but house churches. But it's that sense of how do we form bands of believers who are committed to reaching a neighborhood or a network of people. And saying we share this vision. So it's built up, there might be leaders who fire that up and fuel it and keep us pointed in the right direction, but it's saying how do we go and not just do it solo? Because I think when we do it solo, we do get picked off by the enemy. So that's quite a countercultural thing, isn't it, for our culture? How do we do it in groups?
And have you seen that work well to have a communal culture in the West? That we're doing this together. We have this common vision. We know, say, this neighborhood's our neighborhood. We're going to really make a change here, and we're doing it together. Have you seen that work well?
Yes, we have. So so we came to the States in 2007 from England, and we served in several churches where we were really called initially to help them develop this more missional culture, building communities on a common vision. So we've personally seen about 130 plus of these start, and obviously helped other leaders do this in their context. So, and obviously varying degrees of competency and effectiveness. But so you got the spectrum there. But I think if we can and we're not the only people doing it. Clearly, lots of people are trying these
Right.
things. But I think yes, it does work, and it can actually be a lot of fun
Mm-hmm.
doing it. Um, so it's something we have to keep wrestling with. We have to keep working. I think it's going to keep evolving. It's going to have to evolve now as we come out of COVID. It's
Yep.
going to look a bit different in the next few years. Increasingly, more depending where you are, but the more post-Christian the culture, it looks a bit different. But yes, it works. Yes, it's happening in the West. I actually think in the more post-Christian context of the West, it's going to be a vital tool.
Yeah,
To be
I think
honest.
it'll be vital, but I think it actually might be easier to do
Yes.
it in a post-Christian world than it is in a Christendom world where everybody has a church. Everybody goes to the church down the block or something where this is a different paradigm. And so I think
Yes.
in a post-Christian world, we're going to look around and we're going to like, well, we have to do something. And what happened in the past isn't really working now. So what do we need to do? And we need to do something different. It's going to be helpful for us to move forward.
Yeah, and it's thinking, okay, what is good news in this context? So
Yeah.
as we try to reach this neighborhood or this elementary school or whatever it is, this college campus, what does the kingdom coming look like?
Mm.
What would most impact people's hearts and lives that would draw them to Jesus in this place? And
Right.
it's working on those things, I think, is often a pointer.
Do you have any good questions or entry points that you use in communities where you can find out what is good news for that area?
It's you look that you're looking at what causes pain.
Yep.
So what are the things people are talking about that's, you can summarize as causing them pain? What do people celebrate? What do people rejoice in? That's a good indicator.
Yeah.
You're looking at what do people spend their money on, both good and bad. That can be a pointer. You're looking at who's got the power. So what are the levers of power and how's that being expressed or not? Is it functional? Is it dysfunctional?
Yeah.
That looks like. So I think you're trying to do that, missionary, kind of basic missionary tools. What's good, what's not good, what's working, what's not working in this particular subculture.
Yeah. And that's helpful. I mean, I think we often think here in the West, especially in an individualistic culture, the good news of, Jesus dying for our sins, that he's our mediator before God, that we now have this relationship with God. That is good news. It's very true. But sometimes that's not going to hit everybody in the same way if that's the first entry point that we have. Sometimes Jesus wants to encounter somebody in a different way that says, I'm good news for the specific situation that you're going through at the moment. And so, my wife and I lived in the Middle East for a long time, and we worked with Syrian refugees. So if a refugee comes in and they're coming in from a war zone, they've seen a lot of family members die. They've seen a lot of horrible, horrific things. It's hard to say, well, what is good news in the middle of that? But Jesus was hope for them. And so we often started with a story of something like Jesus calms the storm, where Jesus can start to calm the storm in their life. And that started to open people up to say, oh, maybe Jesus is good news for the storm that I'm going through in my life. And then they're willing to start to step forward into a Jesus conversation. And what does it look like to bring hope? And so we saw that because we asked people their story, we engaged them on a specific level in the living room, and we were able to say, hey, here is a story of Jesus that could help. Or, hey, you're sick, let's pray for a healing. Or you need a refrigerator, let's pray that God will provide for you. There is all sorts of good news that really opens people up to more of a life and a hope in Jesus. And that we found that really helpful to us.
I love the way how you're anchoring that in scripture as well, where that's, where you can authentically do that. And that's really powerful too, isn't it? That kind of brings that alive, helps people encounter Jesus in the Bible. And what I hear you say is a phrase that we use a lot, which is we'd say, can I pray for you?
Yeah.
So there's so many situations, and it could be difficult, like what you described there, those poor folks coming out of
Yep.
Syria, just unbelievable devastation and awfulness. But it could be to someone's it's equally a good thing happening. You've got a
Right.
brand new baby, you coo and but also it's great to say, hey, this might sound crazy, but I would love to just pray God's blessing on your baby. Could you just pray for your baby, pray God to bless your child? I mean, you've got to be a pretty militant atheist to not want that. So, it could be just a real simple thing like that through to, I mean, obviously what you and the wife experience, extreme thing, but there's still, the same principles apply, don't they? Which is, I think one things we talk about is we have to operate like spiritual people. And I think too often Christians don't want to operate as spiritual people. We want to operate with resources as the world. And we do have those resources.
No.
But it is crazy because, I think we need to operate like, we need to be outed as followers of Jesus. And also we need to trust that our non-Christian friends like the fact that we're spiritual people.
Yeah.
So they like the fact that we're a little bit different. And it might be, we might be curious and we might be a bit eccentric in their eyes. But I just believe that I accept them for who they are and they accept me for who I am. And part of who I am is I'm a Jesus follower. So if you're sick, I'm going to offer to pray for you. Yeah. Or whatever, you're stressed.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in these places where we're on mission.
Yeah. I mean, I have a friend that says you want to be spiritually obvious without being spiritually obnoxious. And I think that that's part of what you talk about as being naturally supernatural, that you want to be spiritually obvious, right? But you don't want to be obnoxious to turn people away, turn people off. But people are attracted to that. They're spiritual people. Every single person is a spiritual person, and they have a spiritual need and a desire that they want to engage with. And so really, our job is to let people know that we're safe to approach and talk to about spiritual things. I find it so much more difficult to talk to people about spiritual things in the West than I do in the Middle East with Muslims. Every other sentence has God in it when you're talking to a Muslim, right? It's very easy and simple to talk to them about spiritual things. It just invades their whole conversation. And so what are some of the tricks and the tools that you use to really engage people in a natural way in spiritual conversation and spiritual things?
One way we describe this is we think of a manual gear stick on a car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's 6 gears, say, on that, and the reverse. So we think of different gears in the conversation. So first gear is casual conversation. Hey, how are you? Sport, weather, job, whatever. That's fine. We all need to do that stuff. Second gear is a meaningful conversation. So that's we start to get a bit nosier. I think we're meant to be nosy in conversations, and it's really about the why and the what questions. Oh, that's interesting. So it sounds like you're really good at your job. What is it about you that makes you so good as a teacher? Or tell me a bit more. You mentioned about it's been stressful, the kids going back to school. What is it that you're most concerned about as your kids go back to school? So you just ask great, open, thoughtful questions. And I think you keep pushing until someone really resists. But you're having meaningful conversations. Most people don't even have meaningful conversations. Right. And then the shift from meaningful to third gear is a spiritual conversation. And that's some stuff you've just been talking about, which I think, summary phrase would be, can I pray for you? But it's some sort of sense of how does Jesus want to intersect them there? And then the fourth gear is where you start to move to a salvation conversation. Not that every time you have to download the whole thing or they're necessarily going to pray and receive Christ in a moment, but you have we have a conversation where you talk about what it means to follow Jesus and invite them to consider that or whatever. Yeah. And then 2 more gears, which are kind of when you really are committed to Christ. So it's maturity conversation is 5th gear, and 6th gear is a leadership conversation. But we have to remember in any of these, there's always reverse, and the other person can reverse out at any point. Yeah. And also with gears, sometimes you have to drop down a gear. If you think of driving a car, sometimes you have to drop down the gear to get the revs up to get up the hill. Or to get start if you've had to stop at some traffic lights. So sometimes it might be you drop down and have a little laugh about something or, whatever, talk about the food. And that's okay. But I think what I've noticed with a lot of Christians is they try and go from 1st gear to 4th gear. Yeah. And if you do that in a car, even 1st to 3rd, what happens is you get a massive kangaroo effect and everyone gets whiplash. And if the car doesn't completely stall, it's incredibly noisy and disruptive. Yep. So we need to, I think as Christians, we need to just allow us to go through those processes and work out which ones you don't naturally go to and really be disciplined about stepping into that.
That's so good.
So it's things like, it's thinking in those ways, just kind of breaking it down for folks who are trying to lead into these things and say, okay, as you think about your friends, what does that look like? So I think we do that. Another paradigm we talk about is we need to start with prayer. It's amazing how few Christians actually pray for their lost friends.
Yeah.
So we need to be praying. And so the way we would just describe it, the phrase that we've taught our folks is we say, who are your three? So who are three people in your place of mission who are currently lost, you pray for by name every single day, many days as you can remember. So I've got three guys who live on my street, which is our primary place of mission. Hannah, my wife's got three women on our street. We pray for them by name. And then the other half of praying, I think that's really easy. We can get people doing is prayer walking, because it changes the spiritual atmosphere in the place. So you start with prayer. And the second thing we'd say after that is, as you're praying, the word we use is parties. So what does it look like to build community in your place of mission?
Yep.
So that's what parties represent. Now, party could be just two people having a cup of tea, or it could be, a household comes down for dinner, or it could be you do a big thing in your backyard, whatever. So, and again, it's going to be defined by your context, what's appropriate. So and really what you're doing in those spaces is you're building community, you become a hub of activity, you do get favor. We've noticed it. We've been very intentional during COVID to do that in our context. We were doing it before, but we've really pushed into it. And we know we've heard enough stories back now that people really view us with a lot of kindness and favor. We've got a bunch of Orthodox Jews on our street and they think we're great, even though they're very separatist generally as a subculture. But I think that kind of, how do we build community? And then in the context of you building community, you're looking for the ones who are your people of peace, who are, they like how Jesus looks in you. And so you're looking for those, and they're the ones you're particularly going to invest into. And, you hopefully you move to a place where you can do the "can I pray for you" sort of conversations. So, so something we'd say to churches sometimes, if you as a community did the praying, the parties, and looking for your people of peace, do that consistently for 1 year. It's all you want you to do, and see what happens.
Yeah. I think we often in the West, we miss that first part and second part of praying and then your parties, is that building of the community in your area, because we're so individualistic in the West that we don't have community. So we often, we teach a lot about disciple-making movements, church planting movements, and we talk about the person of peace. And in places where there's already an established community, that's the first place we go to, is the person of peace. But we actually have to step back here in the West, and we have to build community first, because we don't have a community for the gospel to actually flow through, because it's not built yet. So I think that's brilliant to be able to go and help people to understand that building community in an area that you live and you work and you play is really crucial, and something that we have to walk in, and we have to start to do that with other people. We have to bring others along so that that community can be built. And so, like, for example, in our street in Kansas City, where we have, I go to a church where three times a month we meet in homes. Then we have a large gathering once a month. So we're in my home primarily most of the time. And so we've built this community where people down the street have noticed, and we have had people on the street come to church. We've had people come down and ask for prayer for things that they've going through. And we've had people come and bring us food. There's all sorts of things that have started to happen. The people have gotten on a text chain, and it's because I think we've been people that are spiritually obvious in our neighborhood, and those people that want that and are attracted to that are coming out of the woodwork in our community. And it's not just people going into their garages and then not seeing each other for the rest of the day.
Yes, I love that. That's so cool. Yeah. And I think with like you say, like you've done, I'm not as extreme as you going to the Middle East, obviously, but so in England and the US, we've moved quite a few times. So we've always started praying, "Who are our people of peace, Lord," in the new plans and all that stuff. And I agree. I think we're seeing more and more. There's this. You have to, even someone who's spiritually open to you and has the marks of a person of peace. So many of them don't actually have a community around them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we start to form communities for folks to allow the gospel to transfer. So, and I think the more, so we live in Los Angeles now, and having lived in Oklahoma City and Northeast Ohio, so we've lived in different parts of the US.
But a little different.
Very different, yeah. Came from England to Oklahoma. We thought it was 2 years for a bit of cross-cultural experience. So it was cross-cultural,
Yeah.
We loved it. Actually, hello Okies. We loved Oklahoma. We love it, love it. It was so warm and fun and delightful, but it was very different, which is awesome. And actually, I'm glad we had that. We're glad we had living this, because I think if it comes to LA, it's more like Europe. So in some ways it was less stretching.
Yeah.
But somewhere like LA, there's such a lack of community. It's been incredible to see. So you really have to work hard at that. And now the good news, of course, is the bar is so low. Anything you do makes you look like a genius in the community, in your neighborhood or your school or whatever it is. But I think people don't know how to do the community piece. We're so fragmented in the culture.
Yeah. That's important. If living in the Middle East, we saw a lot of things happen. We saw a lot of dreams of Jesus. We saw mute people start to speak again. We saw a lot of, healing of cancer, and a lot of provision, a lot of signs and wonders, things that are naturally happening in that area. I mean, it didn't happen every day, but it probably did somewhere every day, just not in our, sphere. So why do you think that primarily people don't notice it happening in the West? I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. I'm just saying people don't notice it happening in the West.
I like the way you frame that question. I wonder if it's to do with persistent expectancy. So I think if we want to step into that more naturally supernatural, being empowered by the Spirit, need to come with a solid expectancy or faith that when we pray, God is a good God. He's not in a bad mood. He does like to heal or answer prayer or bring peace to those folks you were talking about in the refugee camp or whatever it is. We could list the range of things that we're not having to prize them out of his grip or something. He wants to give these things more than we do. He hates cancer more than we do, etc. So, and also we have this faith that when we pray, we really can start to access some of the resources of heaven. So there's a high faith quotient, and clearly Jesus talks about faith a great deal. Somewhere in the equation, faith has to come in, whether it's the one who needs the thing, or it's the one praying, or their family member, or the community. There is this faith piece, but there's also a persistence piece, and so it's something about. Now, sometimes we get the immediate breakthrough, like you just described, and sometimes we pray 100 times to get the breakthrough. And I wonder if part of the problem is it's to do with the quality of our faith. We don't persist in things. We're not willing to fight the fight. Whereas you can answer this bit. I don't know whether it'd be true to say that folks in non-Western nations, because they are more obviously materially needy as a rule, they're more willing to persist and to fight for it. Whereas for us, we're so kind of pampered and spoiled in the West as a rule. Not everyone, obviously. But generalizing, I wonder if we just don't know the disciplines of persistence.
We're just too comfortable.
It's even little things like, I remember we've got 3 sons who are now young adults, but I remember when they were little, from the get-go, we pray for you. When someone's, you have the bump or the boo-boo or whatever it is when you're 2.5 years old. So we'd try and start with prayer rather than, whatever the medicine would be. So, but I think most of us don't do that. We don't start with prayer.
We go straight to the medicine. We have, we actually, because, we grow up in such a scientific worldview of saying whatever is observable and whatever we can see and whatever we can test and verify is what is true and real. And so when we're in, say, the the excluded middle part where
Yes.
we have this supernatural world where
Yes.
we can't always see it physically and touch it and feel it and test it. We often ignore it.
Mm.
And so because we ignore it, we don't go to it. We go straight to what we already know.
Mm.
And so, I know in a lot of places that middle part it drives them into their behavior of how they even act and interact in the world. They believe that, spirits are in control of this or that. So they're going to make sure that their house is in a
Yeah.
particularly way. It just really depends on their behavior because they know that this excluded middle, the spiritual world, actually is real. And so they go directly there right away. And we don't in the West because we just go into what is observable. And so I think that persistence, for me, because I've seen some of it, I've seen some healing, I've seen some of this supernatural, I've actually observed it myself. I
Mhm.
feel like I have more faith for it.
Exactly.
And some people haven't observed it. And so when they live in that scientific worldview, they're not going to persist.
I think also I agree with everything you just said. I think also it's we as Christians or we as churches, part of our failure of discipleship is we haven't taught folks that we are meant to be. There is that I agree with the excluded middle concept. That
Right.
there's supernatural stuff that's kind of bubbling away in people, but they don't almost have language or framework for it. So they come up with all sorts of hocus pocus nonsense. But actually, I think we as believers need to step into that space rather than being afraid of it and running away, which
Yeah.
is, to us, what most evangelical do. And I'd say I'm an evangelical theologically, but we need to be spirit empowered and not be afraid to go to those places. So a good example, I think, is before all our eyes right now, which is Halloween.
Yeah.
So, we know what actually, if we stop and think what it actually is about, it's a horrendous festival. It's absolutely, totally demonic.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting one in that I think it's an opportunity to have spiritual conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something that's been on my mind to do, which kind of I think is going to be once a bit clear of COVID, is I would like to start offering spiritual house cleansings in our community. Because we've had that happen a few times with neighbors. People say, I've got this, literally one of our next door neighbors, they went away on vacation. They had us look after that, keep an eye on the house, water the plants. And the woman who she's not yet a believer, but she's very spiritually open. She's one of the people of peace for Hannah. And she said she's really casually as she was leaving, she says, so when you're in the house, if you feel like praying in my daughter's bedroom, it feels quite dark in there. That would be great.
Mm-hmm.
So we go in there and we did pray. And there's a whole backstory there. But when they came back from vacation, she said, Hannah, you prayed, didn't you? And I said, yes, we did actually. She said, I could feel the difference.
Wow.
And we've seen it happen lots of times. So I think there's something, it's finding the hooks into our community where we can be, again, out as believers, we can be overtly spiritual in ways that start to touch upon some of their felt needs.
That's so good.
Where are the edges where people open? And if you look at the fascination with horror and with, dark stuff and the novels that lots of particularly, adolescents are reading, or that there's a lot that this stuff isn't just there because people go, it's just a bit of fun. Right. It's more than just a variation of Star Wars or something. I think people recognize, enough people who mess with it realize there's something there.
Yeah.
And I think we clearly do have a message that starts to respond to that and helps explain it, but also can deal with it as well. So I think we as believers need to step into the greater confidence in those moments of responding well.
Yeah. As thinking about Halloween, I'm thinking a little bit right now. I'm thinking about my 4-year-old son. But having a 4-year-old reminds me that he wants to talk about spiritual things. He has a spiritual curiosity from a very young age. A lot of times he's thinking, he's having dreams. What does this dream mean? He's, maybe having a vision or something where he gets scared. But he wants to talk about spiritual things. And he knows, so from the very beginnings of our life, we're very much spiritual people and engaged in that spiritual world. Why do you think we lose some of that in the West growing up?
It's a culture that doesn't value the rational. So like you were describing earlier. So I remember having a conversation with one of my neighbors who's an atheist Indian rocket scientist. And so he's actually got more cultural Hinduism than he lets on. But we used to go out and have a beer and debate. He loved debating it. We really, we had great conversations. But I remember talking about the healing thing, like you mentioned earlier, miraculous. And this was, I told him a story of someone, a young woman we know, church planter, and she'd had multiple sclerosis, and we were part of a group praying for her, and she got completely healed. And the doctors have no medical explanation for how, because it's not something, physically it can't go into remission.
Right. Yeah.
There's no way what happened. So, and we've seen that disease heal before with another person in the church back in England. So, and his response is, well, it was long lines. It's unless I can see that repeated in a science lab 100 times out of 100, I'm not going to believe in it. So, then I did the old kind of classic. I said, well, prove to me that your wife loves you. And, of course you can't, because it's a different type of knowledge. It's not a scientific knowledge. It's a relational knowledge. And I think I think often our popular culture at one level, and the way we're educated is so, it claims it's scientific. I don't think it's that scientific half the time, but it's very poo-poo of these things.
Yeah.
But we need to be not unwilling to push back on that and equip our kids how to view things, how to process stuff, and how to spot the moments where we can challenge that prevailing narrative.
Yeah.
Because actually, like we were saying, I think there's a heck of a lot of people who do think there's a spiritual realm.
Yeah.
And they are open to this stuff. They're not quite sure how to access it. They don't like the church. They don't like religious hypocrisy and so on.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean they're not open to the spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I have some friends that were up in Portland this summer, and, that's probably one of the most post-Christendom places in the U.S. At the moment. And my friend was saying that I didn't even try to have Jesus conversations, but people were just giving their lives to Jesus. It just naturally came up because people are naturally spiritually curious in that place, and they have such a yearning in their soul for an answer in that spiritual part of their life. And so I think you're right. People are open to it, and I think people are willing to engage that. I think that in my experience in church in the West, a lot of the church is afraid to engage in those conversations with people in a spiritual time and place. And I think, Jesus himself, when he went into a place that we would think would defile us, he wasn't defiled, but people were cleansed and they were whole, and they were healed in the middle of darkness. Right? He brings light into the darkness, which disperses the darkness. We often think that the darkness is going to invade us and infiltrate us, so we don't want to engage in something that is not of the light.
Yes, it's interesting. So where we are we live in Long Beach, South Los Angeles. So it's a place that's got a very large homosexual population. In fact, it's one of the first. It's got a large gay pride festival, and it was one of the first areas where the AIDS kind of was seen and was a big issue. First clinic in town was a Christian clinic, actually. So we know a number of couples. We've got to know there was a couple of guys. They've moved now, but two doors down, we became really close friends with them. Just delightful, really great guys, really fun. We loved being with them. They loved us. They knew they knew we were believers. They knew that we worked in churches and did stuff like that. And, I'm sure they would have known what we thought theologically, perhaps, but we just loved them and were kind to them and enjoyed them as friends, because at the end of the day, conviction is not, I don't have to convict them. That's Jesus's problem to sort out. That's not my problem to solve. So I'm just going to love them like I'm told to do and wait for the opportunities. And then one of the guys had cancer. It was a treatable form, unfortunately, but so obviously we wanted to serve them and love them, and but interestingly, I felt God put in my heart to get them a peace lily. And I couldn't find a peace lily, so I got another lily, and I took it round. I said, "This is meant to be a peace lily. They don't have peace lilies in the store, but this is a peace lily." So pretend it is. What you do is put it in your living room, and every time either of you feel anxiety or worry or fear about what's going to happen, I want you to look at this and know that Jesus loves you, and He's going to see you through this. So it became like a sacrament almost, in that a physical manifestation of something spiritual. And it was interesting. And obviously we did serve them and did some stuff for them, but they said on a number of occasions, the thing that they most appreciated about us was that we were praying for them. And then out of that, we ended up having some very profound, like really deep spiritual conversation about some of their history and, sexual identity and so on. And they were very, very open and vulnerable. And then it was interesting when they moved away because of work. And on the last day, one of the guys had moved ahead. One was back in the house. So his last day in city, we said, "Well, can we throw you a party, get some of the neighbors around?" He didn't want to do that. He said, "I want to go out for dinner with you two." So this dinner, and on the way, when we get back to the house, he's never forget this. He stood on our front doorstep and he pointed at me and he said, "You have incredible power." And he pointed at her and said, "You too, you've got amazing power."
Wow.
And it was his way of trying to say there's something that he'd seen in us that represent. He meant spiritually.
Yeah.
In context of what's going on. And, I think, as we're trying to reach marginalized communities or communities who the church hasn't done a great job of reaching, there's ways of doing that where we can go at peace with who we are. Like, you don't have to water down the gospel or our ethics or whatever the thing is, but we don't have to go and whack people either to prove that we're theologically correct. And we could just be, Jesus models it, for goodness sake. And he's the one who's accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. I don't think Jesus was a drunkard, but he was accused of that because he was obviously hanging out with drunkards and able to be there. So there's this tension of, it's this good little kind of matrix thing we draw, which is this distinct, we wrestle with being highly distinctive, which is the call to holiness, but also highly connected, which is we build relationships. So we want to be the ones who our neighbors will say, "I'd love to hang out with Josh. He's great. He's so cool. He's such a laugh." We want to be like that. But also, we know we're meant to carry something different for Jesus. And I think we can hold those two things, creative tension. I think what most people do is they won't live in that tension where things are going to be messy and mucky, and it's not going to be ideal solutions. I remember in one church we were in, we were seeing some real fruit in our missional communities. And there was two ladies who were a lesbian couple. They had several children by adoption, and another child was that one of them was pregnant through artificial insemination. And they started coming to one of the missional communities. They got just loved really well. They really enjoyed going there. And they were just able to belong before they had to believe or behave. And they were loved and they started to encounter Jesus. So one day, they had one daughter who was like 9 or 10. She comes home from school and says something like, "Mummy, what's a lesbian?" And the mother says, "Where'd you hear that?" And she's heard it at school, and someone says, "That's what you are." So they have this conversation, and but then she goes, the woman says, "Well, you know that we've been going to the missional community, the group." She daughter says, "Yes." She said, "Well, we've been encountering Jesus there, and actually, Mummy and I, we believe that Jesus is saying he wants us to live a purer lifestyle. So we're not going to live." So basically, they were choosing to live a celibate lifestyle afterwards. So they were really making journey. They were on the journey, and their baby was there, and they wanted to dedicate the baby. So we did a baby dedication thing in the service, and there was a number of other couples, and then there's this lesbian couple there dedicated to their baby. And there were a couple of interesting, two households in particular. not old households, people in their 30s, early 30s, and they were furious that we dedicated that baby.
Yeah.
Really angry. And I said, well, look, there's a whole backstory here, which we didn't say publicly because we're not exposing people like that.
Right.
And the bar for baby dedication is not super high. And there's going to be other couples. Just because they're a heterosexual couple doesn't mean there was an issue with rampant greed or anger or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just you're not seeing it. But this guy said to me, he said, well, you did the wrong thing. I said, well, what would you have done? He said, I would have told them, you two have got to separate. You've got to go and each find a husband. And when you've got a husband, come back and bring your baby, then we'll dedicate it. And I'm like, mate, I know that might be the ideal, but when we're dealing with people far from Christ, you can't start from that place of perfection. It's just how it is. They've got a massive history, and we have to work with where they are, not where the ideal is. And the problem with being on mission is it's just very messy, and we have these complex things where we're trying to hold that tension of being, yes, we have to be a distinctive community. We're called to be a holy community, but also we're called to be intensely welcoming and inclusive as well. And how you hold those two things. Don't slip into being liberalism, where it's just inclusive, or being Pharisees, where it's all about the holiness. We have to do both simultaneously. And we're going to get it wrong sometimes. We know that. But I think there's something there we have to wrestle with and fight with.
Yeah.
Fight for it, rather.
That's so good. Thank you. That's great. Just a couple of questions I like to ask. One is, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I think live more comfortably with some of the paradoxes of following Jesus.
Yeah.
I think when you're 21, you kind of, well, not every 21, but I think I was, I had a theology degree. I kind of felt like I knew a lot of the answers.
Yeah.
And that, again, you can do that without, I'm not wishy-washy liberal and loads of stuff, but I think there's a sense of, it's like the bigger the circle of knowledge, the greater the circumference of what you don't know.
Yeah.
So there's things where we have to live in that tension. So there's a paradox to following Jesus we have to learn to live with.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice, and good to be able to live in that paradox. And then anything you've been reading or watching lately that you could recommend?
Well, obviously the new James Bond movie, because I'm English, so I have to recommend that. Anyway, no spoilers. That was very good.
No spoilers. I won't say anything. It was good. It was really good.
It was good.
And see it. Yeah.
You did a nice job of rounding out that arc of the last 4 or 5 movies.
Yeah.
We've been reading a lot, just going back to books around the natural supernatural. So just trying to read a lot around those areas. We're trying to write books in that area as well, but some of the old classics, going back to John Wimber and Derek Prince on deliverance and those sorts of things. I think we need to keep getting the inputs into ourselves to keep being refreshed, keep thinking in these ways. How do we really work on developing this natural supernatural lifestyle?
Yeah.
And there's good stuff out there, but I think too often we kind of get a certain level of competence and think we've got it. Whereas I think there's more to learn and to grow into.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So you have a lot of training, coaching that you could have people engaged in. How can they engage some of the training and coaching that you do?
So we have a website, and it's dandelionresourcing.com. So dandelion, as in the flower, which becomes a bunch of seeds, and that came from a picture that the Lord gave Hannah, which is imagine seeds, and they're blown by the wind of the Spirit, and they can scatter anywhere, and even get into a little nook or cranny, a crack in the concrete, pop down a root, up comes a stalk. There's a yellow flower, there's seeds, and it multiplies. And there's something very lightweight and spirit blend that we're meant to be about as we go with the gospel. It's not meant to be some hugely complex things. So that's why it's Dandelion Resourcing. And if you go there, there's a bunch of stuff. There's free stuff, and there's information about some of the cohorts and coaching that we do. So that would be a good place to check us out.
Great. So check it out. Check out Dandelion Resourcing, and I think you'll be the better for it. So engage with Alex and Hannah in what they do. And I just one of the things I wanted to touch on that we didn't have time for is just working and living with your wife and leading and coaching and training with her. I do the same thing with my wife. We're co-executive directors at All Nations, and we do a lot of training together. So I would have really enjoyed talking to somebody else that doesn't. I don't get to meet too many people
Mm.
that
Mm.
actually have that kind of a relationship with their spouse. So hopefully it is as rewarding for you as it is for me.
I love it. And I think it's fun to be able to do stuff together, obviously, as a
Yeah.
couple. I think Hannah impacts different people differently to how I do.
Yep.
And it just makes it way richer. And she'll think about things a little differently,
Yeah.
which is so good. So,
Yeah.
I'm a bit more hard charging. So one of the disciplines I had to learn earlier on was to slow down and let her have room to breathe and to contribute.
Yeah.
And that's been such a rewarding thing to do.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. It was just a great conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.